Hi, this is The Greatest Story Ever Played. I'm Dan, and I'm joined by Jake from the pre-order bonus.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's really good to be back. I was super excited when I saw your message, and I'm super excited to talk about the game that we're discussing tonight. So when you sent me that message, and then you're like, "Hey, been thinking about playing Where the Water Tastes Like Wine." This is one that actually been sitting in my wish list for several months.
Oh,
Uh,
that's perfect.
so I was like, "Great, finally, okay, I'm gonna buy this and I'm gonna play it."
That's awesome. That's good to hear. I'm really glad about that. I'd had this on my horizon for a while too. I was like, this seems like a thing I would like. And then once I looked further into it, I was like, I got to talk to someone about this. And then I thought that you would be absolutely perfect for this.
uh,
Listeners of
Thanks.
our show may or may not know this, but you have a PhD in literature, and so I feel like that is a very fitting for this game. I feel like this is a game probably made for people who are probably like you or I. I don't have a PhD or anything, but I like reading, so I feel like this is probably the vibe for a certain demographic that we are probably both part of.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, reading through this, I definitely was actually thinking of some ways because I've been pretty sneaky in my classes these last few semesters of kind of tucking in video games into some of the into some of the course. And as I was going through this, I was like, "Ooh, this could be a really fun one to teach because of the way that just it's about stories and it's about a pretty well-known American literary tradition and the way that the stories involve. I just thought it was a really cool way of sort of combining video games and like video game ness of playing and interaction with stories and seeing how stories can change. So I thought it was a super cool game. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, me too. I guess actually, we should have done this first, but so Jake has also actually been on here before. Him and his co-host partner Cameron, co-host, came and we
Hmm.
talked about Super Mario Odyssey at the end of last year, which was fun. But also, if you don't know about their podcast, Jake, do you want to tell people about your guys' show?
Yeah, sure thing. So I am one half, as Dan has discussed, of the pre-order bonus podcast. We have found it as incredibly difficult to search for our podcast name. So if we could change one thing, it would probably be that. But yeah, our podcast is it's a little different than the greatest story ever played in that rather than just focusing on narrative or the bulk of things being focused on narrative, we talk about video games in four categories every episode. We discuss the narrative, then the mechanics, the gameplay loop, and then we speculate what we think the impact of that game is on the industry. And so, if you like those types of categories, if you like that type of discussion of video games, that's what we do. And I think that's kind of how, we started following The Greatest Story Ever Played. And that's kind of how we got connected because we do talk about video games in that way rather than just talking about whether or not we'd enjoyed them or giving them a letter grade. We like to discuss like those finer details, and so it's been really fun listening to the greatest story ever played. I had a blast last time we talked Super Mario Odyssey, and so like I said, when I saw the message here, I was like, all right, let's do it. I was raring to go.
Yeah, totally. I think something that I really enjoy about your show is because you break it down in those categories. There's a lot of games that we've gotten to cover over the last several years that you guys have also hit up, and it's cool getting this other perspective or other details on games. So that's something I know I personally love a lot. Is cool. I've played this game. Do you guys have an episode on it? Because I want to see what someone else thought about this, and some of the highlights that you guys are going to hit that I probably didn't. So yeah, totally cool stuff. But yeah, if you haven't listened to their podcast, definitely go check it out. Also, I'll link all the stuff in the show notes and stuff. So definitely go check that out. I think they're a podcast that should be part of your rotation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, let's get to it. I don't know. I'm ready. I've been thinking about this game nonstop for the past few weeks.
Yeah, no, let's do it. I can start us off with a description that we got for the game.
Hmm.
So It says, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is a narrative adventure about traveling, sharing stories, and surviving manifest destiny. Featuring a gorgeous hand-drawn illustrations, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine combines 2D visuals with a 3D overworld map of the United States. Players wander across a folkloric Depression-era United States at their own pace, meeting with strangers with their own stories to tell. Through these interactions, players will be able to collect unique stories, which then can be retold to unlock new interactions. In this way, the in game stories themselves act as the currency to progress through the game, and it's up to the player to pair the right story with the unique needs of each character they'll encounter throughout their travels. Only through the right pairings will characters reveal their true selves and bestow on you the most powerful stories, the true ones which reveal something about their own lives. And then, I guess, kind of adding some background on the game itself, this was developed by Dimbulb Games, and Dimbulb Games was founded by Johanneman Nordhagen, who was one of the founders of Fulbright Studios, who made Gone Home. So if you're familiar with Gone Home, he is from that. He was one of the three main people on that game.
Very cool.
Yeah, for sure. So cool kind of seeing where he came from, all of that. So I think kind of last thing we should do before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of this game is talk about some non-spoiler thoughts. You may have heard about Where the Water Tastes Like Wine and, have seen it as a game that's around, but you're maybe not sure, is this a game I want to play, whatever, that kind of stuff. So we'll take a couple minutes just to talk about, what do we think about it without kind of spoiling main stuff. I guess one thing I can say off top for me is I feel like what drew me to this game initially and then proved true is when I'd heard about this game, I was like, this sounds like a John Steinbeck novel, or reading On the Road by Jack Kerouac, except it's a walking sim. And so I was like, cool, I like all of those things. Like, when you read On the Road and it's just like, oh, we're driving around and then we eat Franks and beans and then we met some guy and then we did this thing, and you're like, cool,
Yeah.
I'm into this.
Yeah.
That's a vibe, and I'm down to be a part of it. And I feel like that is what this game is, for sure. I feel like if John Steinbeck played video games and was alive, he'd play this game.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I had similar thoughts. I thought it was really cool because this game represents Dust Bowl Depression era USA, which I think is relatively underrepresented in a lot of media, just generally. So the time period that it's honed in on, I think, is really cool. It's not exactly like a real celebratory time in American history, which is why I kind of think a lot of the literature produced about this time period and from this time period, it tends to be a little more tragic in nature. It tends to be a little more critical in a lot of ways. And I honestly, like you, I thought that Where the Water Tastes Like Wine really fits in with just literature of the time period. John Steinbeck, obviously, I think is a really good one to mention. This also made me think of a collection of poetry that I read a long time ago, and it's called the Spoon River Anthology. It's by Edgar Lee Masters. Now, this isn't necessarily a huge masterpiece of literature, but it does do something really phenomenal. And what it does is each poem is essentially, excuse me, it's one epitaph of the town cemetery. And the epitaph kind of reveals the true feelings or the true natures or the true circumstances surrounding somebody's death from this town. And so you get to know this community exceptionally well because once all these people have died, it's kind of like their ghosts are sitting around and gossiping about what life was really like and what they really thought of each other.
Oh, cool.
And so it's a really cool collection. And it reminded me a lot of this game, or I was thinking of it a lot while playing this game, just because some similar things happen. As you mentioned, there's several key characters that you get to know, and they start revealing more about their true selves. I would say this game's a little more optimistic, which is kind of hard to believe because there's not too much optimism in this game. um, or I guess a better way of phrasing it is that the Spoon River anthology is like pretty like gossipy in the way that people interact with each other, and that's really not the case in Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. So anyway, I really liked it. We were just talking before we were recording. I think this game utilizes the open world format exceptionally well. Now, I think most people who are thinking about open world games are thinking about like open world in combat and lots of like really exciting adventure. And this game is not that. I mean, it's a great game, but it's slow.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, it's very slowly paced. And so you just have to go into it with different expectations. But I think if we were to like write out a definition of what an open world game is, and we were to look at Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, like it checks all the boxes for sure. Like I
Yeah.
think it does a great job there.
Yeah, and now that you say that too, what an unusual thing that you're both an open world game and slow paced. I wonder
Hmm.
if that combination has even been done very often, because like those don't seem like things that would naturally go together.
Yeah, they really don't, and it's kind of funny because I actually started playing Death Stranding the same time I was playing this game.
Ooh.
and and honestly, it's funny because I was texting a friend. I was like, I'm playing two games right now, and they're both like the most walking sims that you could have. But I was like, I love them both. Like I'm actually really enjoying both of them. Yeah.
That's good to hear. I haven't played Death Stranding, but that was what I would imagine in my head. So hearing that you like it and having like this game, I'm wondering. I've been a little intimidated by it, but maybe I should give it a go because I like walking sims, but typically they're like 3 hours and not however long Death Stranding is.
I mean,
I
oh,
know it's a
I'm not
monster.
even. It is a monster. I mean, I really like it. I would. I'm not. Excuse me. I'm also playing on easy, which I actually really am grateful for because it makes it more of a walking sim and less of like a stealth game. And really, combat isn't hugely important because I'm playing it on easy.
Mhm.
Because I actually just love walking in that game, which is I don't know. I mean, if a game is going to be a walking sim, you have to enjoy walking, I guess, right?
That's true. If the walking mechanic is bad, you're in trouble for
Yeah.
for something like that. Totally. No, that's true. Um, no, that's awesome. Another thing I liked with this game was the soundtrack for it. I guess this is a mild spoiler, but it's very very mild. Is you go to different regions in the United States and the music changes, which is
Yes.
really really cool. And this wasn't like the moment where I bought in, but there's a moment where you reach the Southwest and then you have Spanish music play,
Hmm.
and that was like a light bulb type moment for me. I was like, that's so cool. Like it
Yeah.
just I think when I had that happen, it was when I walked by the Rockies, and so you see these giant mountains.
Mm.
And before that, on the East Coast, everything's pretty flat. If there's a hill, it's pretty small. And the
Hmm.
Rockies are they're clearly different. They're
Hmm.
huge. You couldn't walk around them, you couldn't look over them, and to walk
Hmm.
into that, and then Spanish music breaks in. Really, really cool.
Yeah.
But the music was done so so well in this game.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I really, really enjoyed listening to the music throughout this game. I had a similar moment, and for me, it was I guess I had that same moment that you're describing when you sort of are heading towards the southwest, and then suddenly, bam, the music's in Spanish. Like it's changed, and you're like, oh man, this is really cool. Like the way that they're reflecting this. And
Mm-hmm.
then a similar moment when I crossed into the south for the first time.
Mm.
Um, and I was like, okay, the music has changed, and it's cool because really it's almost as if it's the same song, but it's like a variation of the same song. Because as I was listening to the music in Spanish, right, because I teach literature from Latin America, I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I'm really curious, and thematically and lyrically things are really similar. And so that's when I started really paying attention to the music and to all the different lyrics. um and yeah, for the most part, like you kind of get the same themes, even though it's like the same lyrical theme, but it's set to a different or slightly different musical background according to the region. And I thought that's just some really cool attention to detail as you're moving through the map.
Right, because there's one song, the Vagrant song, that I think gets kind of repurposed throughout the game, where you'll have a different musical style, and maybe the lyrics change some too, like you said. But it gets repurposed in each area, and it's like you're still getting the same vibe of, like, the song's about being a drifter, and you're like telling stories and stuff like that. And
Right.
you hear that in Maine, you hear that in the Southwest, you hear that in California. Like, it's really cool.
Yeah. Although my favorite song, it's one I actually catch myself humming like while I'm not playing. Do you know do you remember the song White Rider? I feel like it played a lot in like the Southwest.
Yeah. That song's great. Yeah, I like that one a lot too.
That one, oh man.
Because when you meet the cowboy, right, it plays a bit when you're around him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, it's fantastic. And that Ryan Ike is the guy who did the soundtrack, and he did all of it. Like, he had different like singers come, but like to be able to just make a soundtrack and do all these different genres of music based on the region and be able to pull that off, like, bravo. That's some talent.
Yeah, hats off to him. Wonderful job.
Yeah, good stuff for sure. I think that's the main stuff I have that's not spoilers. Did you have any other non-spoiler type stuff you wanted to talk about?
It's kind of hard to say any more than what we've said, I think, without getting into too many spoilers. I mean, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I agree. So yeah, if this sounds like a game you might like, I think if you're someone who likes literary stuff, if you're someone who likes walking sims, this has a chance of being the kind of game you would like. If those don't sound like your thing, it might not be your kind of game. So cool. With that, we will move into spoiler territory. So our game begins with our main character playing a poker game. And so he shows up at, some saloon or whatever and sits down to play poker. And it basically ends up becoming a game between him and one other person. And it's sort of, they take everyone out. They're, building the chips up, all of that stuff. And you get to sort of like a final showdown where, you're calling each other all in. You've got a good hand. They might have a good hand. Like, and the other person has more than you. So they say, okay, well, what else can you offer besides your money? And you offer your blood, right? It's kind of like my word. I will do whatever kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was really cool. It's a very like cinematic moment. I feel like we've seen scenes like this before, high stakes poker matches, and then when you get to the end of it, like I feel like it does a good job of like it does in movies where like you're just compelled. You're like, man, this hand is incredible. Like all in is the only option here. Like. And so I really like this moment a lot. And this is where you get introduced to the main like 2D portrait art style, which I think is really fantastic. And so I feel like this is functioned as a really cool just like introduction, because I think the art sort of reflected like the seedy, not exactly trustful circumstances you find yourself in, but you have been coming up ahead and you have been winning and you have a really good hand. And it's just time to go for it.
Yep. Yeah. So you go for it and, bet your blood, essentially. Like, my word is bond, my blood is bond sort of thing. If I lose this hand, I'll do whatever you want sort of thing. And they have a better hand. Then you get this sort of like transformation. The person you were playing was like seemingly a person, but they transform into this dire wolf who is basically like, I have your blood to be able to like fulfill your contract. I have a task for you. And they want you to go collect stories. And so this sort of sets you off where the game will kind of get you going.
Yeah, I mean, I knew kind of what the premise of the game was going into it, and this moment for me was really curious because as they have this request for you, the direwolf, it makes a pretty serious or pretty obvious distinction between like the types of stories that the direwolf wants and the ones that you're going to encounter throughout the game. And the direwolf says, okay, you are going to meet some people who have true stories, and I want those ones, and I want you to find them, and you're going to have to work to find the truth in these stories. And you're going to also find a bunch of stories out there that are just embellished, that they don't really ring true. They're more for entertainment and like less of somebody's bearing their soul. And I thought that was really interesting because I mean the stakes of the bet obviously are really high. Like you bet your blood, like essentially your life, in this poker match. And so you would think maybe in other circumstances that like immediately the direwolf is going to ask for your like servitude, like, or like in an extreme case, or like, hey, your soul is mine now, whatever it is. And so to be asked to like find true stories, I think was a little bit of a curveball, like compared to other expectations that you might have going into like a supernatural poker, poker game setting. And so it's kind of a relief, but at the same time, there's like suspicion. It's like, okay, but what does the direwolf really want here? And I like that. I like that a lot because as you progress through the game, like you have this clear goal in mind to like find true stories and have people reveal their true selves to you. And then you think, well, what does that really mean? And what does that mean? Like, what is Direwolf really getting out of this? And I think that was a really cool question. We're gonna get to the very ending, which I I'm really excited to talk about. But I think it all makes sense in the end. But definitely for me, as I started, I was like, okay, this is kind of a strange request.
Yeah, totally. I think too this opened up for me. I didn't expect supernatural stuff to be going on even, and so this totally changed my expectations going in. I really thought it would be like grounded in reality, telling stories, drifting around kind of thing, and it was.
Right.
But, some of the stories you meet are pretty normal, but then other ones end up being pretty fantastical. And the direwolf in this whole situation and setting you on your mission set the stage that could happen. And so when they did, I was like, cool, that's not weird because this already happened. Like when you had stuff happen, I think if I wasn't already programmed or whatever for like, okay, cool, weird stuff can happen. I would be like, man, that's a weird story. Why did that happen? But instead, this set it up. I was like, oh yeah, of course that would happen. Like there is weird supernatural stuff that can go on.
Yeah, it definitely makes everything feel a bit more normal, which is good, especially considering some of the stories you come across and just how they evolve. Like we've discussed, like embellishment of stories is like a really key, not only game mechanic, but just like narrative component to this game. And I just think how that evolution happens is really fun. There are some moments where you'll be traveling after you've told a story to somebody, and you'll see a specific icon that indicates, oh, there's a story here that you can listen to, and it's been embellished. And there's always like the option, I feel like, when you hear the person telling a story, to either say like, oh yeah, that's actually not how it happened, or to say, oh man, now that is a great story. And I just thought that was kind of a fun way for you as a player and as a protagonist to kind of play along with the embellishment that's going on with all these stories. It just like a way to really like, I don't know, it was a fun sort of wink, I feel like, at the player every time that happened.
Yeah, totally. I like too that the stories that were getting told, they were symbolized by like an eye, and the more open it was like how popular the story was. And so a story might start off with like a mostly closed eyelid, and then you walk to another town and it's getting told, and then the eyelid's getting bigger, and then once it gets to a point where it's super popular, it's like full open eyelid, and you're like, all right, I've got a good story, it's in circulation. Like it felt like that.
Yeah, I remember going through and like there are so many different stories that you can collect. I think the number is like 237 total stories. And I remember like going through my inventory and then just like checking and seeing, okay, what stories have been embellished, and then that eye indicator just being like a cool way of being like, okay, like how good is this story? Part of it, like I had kind of understood it as like, how eye opening is this story? Like if somebody's listening to me, are they going to be like glued to like what they're hearing, but like eyes wide open because they're so enthralled? And the more closed eyes to me looked a little more sleepy in terms of like, okay, someone's maybe half listening right now. But I thought that eye was a cool sort of indicator, like you did, right? Of, okay, this is a good story.
Yeah, I like that too, and that it just and it felt super normal that you'd have those. It just like the whole vibe felt like people are just all around swapping stories, that kind of thing. Like, you go to a town and it's like construction guys on their lunch break are telling stories, and then you hear an embellished version of a story that you told to someone else earlier, and you're like, "Ooh, I know you," all of that. Like, it was cool. I think that they, for that being like the prime mechanic of how things went, I think they really nailed that.
Yeah, I agree. And the other aspect here is like, if your game's about telling stories, the story's got to be good, right? Otherwise, how interested is the player going to remain as they're going through? And I thought some of these stories, I mean, I think they just did it really well. I mean, I remember like one story in particular, like I was in Boston and I had a taxi driver, drive me somewhere. And the story was just like this really oddly silent taxi driver who was kind of ignoring me. And that turned into a story that I could tell. And that base story wasn't super exciting, but as it grew, it became much more fantastical and much more interesting to listen to. I think another example was a story that I grabbed early on about two women who were like fed up with their lives, and they just wanted to leave. So I like told this story, and it evolved from this story about two women who are angry to these two women who became like notorious bootleggers. And
Yeah.
yeah, okay, so you did this story too. Yeah, and they they had cool names, and it was about how like famous and rowdy they were as lawbreakers. And the story just got cooler with it, and that was one of my go-to stories actually, for a lot of different characters.
Oh, me too. That became like a key story for me, as it just becomes
Mm-hmm.
this, these cool outlaws, and they're like, "You met those outlaws?" Like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that was awesome. That was super cool. So I guess, yeah, we get sent in our mission to collect stories. Oh, I guess also weird side point. The direwolf's voice is by Sting, the musician, which is wild. What a
So wild.
what a random like celebrity appearance in a video game.
Yeah, and I mean he did a great job. So
Oh yeah, he totally did great. I feel like if people need someone to fill that role, you should call Sting for sure. And be
yeah.
like, hey, do you want to be in our game? Because that was awesome in Where the Water Tastes Like Wine.
Mm-hmm.
But you get your mission, and so you get plopped down in Maine to start, and you have the whole United States to cover. So a lot of ground. And each sort of like town or city has some stories or landmarks kind of along the way as you walk across the US. And depending on the city, there's more or less. So, like we mentioned Boston being bigger, there was more to do there. But, as you make your way through some of the Northeast, there's not a lot around, but you might walk and like see an icon for, oh, there's a story over here. It's a lighthouse. I'll go check that out. That kind of thing. And kind of all in all, the stories fall into some like primary categories, which I think these are the four. There's scary stories that people like hearing, hopeful stories, sad ones, and adventure ones. Is that the four, or is there a fifth?
Sometimes people ask for funny, but
Ooh, yes, that's right. Funny is the other one.
yeah, and that one was the hardest one for me to pin down. But
No, that's true. I had multiple times where I had a story where I'm like, oh, this is the one that had me the hardest time with was adventure, because I was like, what
Yeah.
do you think is adventuring? Because at one point I got a story that was about the gangsters in Chicago just like executing people, shooting cops, like all this stuff.
Yeah.
And to me, I was like, that sounds like a gangster movie. That's adventurous. And then I'd give it
Right.
to people, and they're like, "Oh, that's so sad." I'm like, "All right, you and I have different ideas of stories, I guess."
Yeah, oh man, that was probably one of the toughest things I think about this game because you're right, there really only are just like a handful of like key stories and like when you are in the setting, it's a campfire setting, you find somebody at a camp for the night
Mm-hmm.
and if you hold let's see, I was playing on controller, if you hold up on the analog stick, it'll
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, they're looking for a thrilling story, they're looking for a tragic story, they're looking for a funny story, whatever it is. And I would say, okay, so this is what they're looking for. And yeah, whenever they ask for things about adventures, this was also another really tricky one. I had to think to myself, like, okay, like, yeah, what are they going to think is super adventurous or thrilling was another word for it. And I almost feel
Mm-hmm.
like sometimes people wanted like something that was like very much an adventure. Like, hey, we're setting out on adventure, like to find treasure or whatever it is. And sometimes people just wanted to hear like really exciting, like crazy stories. And so one that I used a lot was about Pico Spill, like riding up, lassoing and riding a tornado. And for the most part, that worked when people said they wanted this type of story. So, but sometimes it didn't. And so I almost kind of feel like that there may have been like subcategories that you had to, there was some wiggle room in there about what was going to work. So
Mm-hmm.
you really couldn't like guess at all or like assume very well. You really had to pay attention to what the characters were saying, I felt like. And if they mentioned specifically like ghosts, then I was like, okay, it's got to be a scary story, but it's got to have a ghost in it. And then that would work for me.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. Because I guess too, what you get. So, as you meet people, you have interactions, you collect stories, and how they display on your like story wheel is there's 12 types of stories. So I guess not categories, but types. So like
Yeah.
family or sadness or joy or whatever. But what's weird is so you could have like a joy adventure story or you could have like a joy funny story or, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And so part of the game's like restriction is in each of like the 12 categories, once you use like a family story, you're not allowed to just keep doing family stories. You've got to do these other categories.
Yeah.
And so kind of juggling that and figuring out where your stories fit in the funny, thrilling adventure, whatever.
Hmm.
That was sort of a tough balance because I was like, all right, how do I like weigh my how do I make sure I have even enough stories across the board,
Yeah.
and not just all scary ones or whatever.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I felt like I had so many scary stories. And
Mm-hmm.
there are a few times in the game where I was like, okay, there's a pretty big imbalance here. I need to swap this out for something else because I just think it's gotten too crazy at this point. So scary stories, yeah, I definitely felt like I had a lot of. It's interesting though because I feel like you said, you start in Maine, and when you're in the Northeast, I felt like I was able to get enough stories quickly enough that sort of met most people's needs for the early game, which
Mm-hmm.
I thought was really smart balancing on the side of like the developers. But there were several moments, yeah, within the game I just did like almost a total overhaul of like what stories I was going to use because I was like, no, I've got way too many scary stories. And as things started getting eliminated or they kept wanting, for example, like a funny story, I was like, man, the three funny stories I always use are gone, and I'm just left here with scary stories.
Yep.
So I've got to end the session early. They're gonna move locations. I've got to rearrange, maybe look for some embellished stories, and then find them again. Thankfully, I felt like characters kind of asked for similar types of stories every time, so they weren't
Mm-hmm.
like all over the place, and so that helped with planning a lot more, and I really appreciated that.
Yeah. No, that's true. And uh, yeah, I think just being able to find those because I found one thing I did too was Like when you're having dialogue options where stories could happen, they might show you two icons, and I was like, oh, I have too many family stories. I'm gonna go this other route to get more
Mm-hmm.
stories for this other subcategory,
Mm-hmm.
to hopefully balance myself out a little more too. Because a
Yeah.
lot of the stories would let you sort of choose a trajectory of, is this going to turn into a story focused on this or a story focused on that, based on how you respond to like the initial interaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was also really helpful. Yeah, I just feel like even though like you might, I personally like ran into some walls with some characters. There was enough wiggle room with things like that where it's like, oh, as I'm like experiencing this event, based on one of my actions, I can kind of shape what type of story it will be, and then I can add that story to my inventory. And so I really appreciated things like that for sure. This is a little random, but speaking of which, um, did you know that there's fast travel in the game?
I discovered it like halfway through.
I literally discovered it like 1 minute before I ended the game.
Oh no.
So I was hitching a ton of rides everywhere, and just doing all sorts of odd jobs so I could buy train tickets. And then I was kicking myself, but I was also laughing kind of hard because I was like, "Oh, there's actually a lot easier way to get around the map here."
That helped me out a lot at the end game of
Mm-hmm.
towards the end I got too focused on collecting the stories. So I think at the end of the game I had maybe like 215 stories or something. Like I had a lot.
Whoa,
Yeah.
nice.
And part of it was I just like I like pulled up the map where stories were. I'd fast travel to places near enough and then just search, um,
Mm-hmm.
and just try to get everything I could, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But without that though, I don't know that I would have tried to do that. But I got kind of focused on it for some reason.
Mm.
But yeah, one other thing too, we've talked about it quite a few times, but the stories growing as you share them. And also just sort of the proliferation, I guess, of stories of like, oh,
Yeah.
this is a story that's everywhere around the US. And this reminded me of when I was in like middle school in like, I don't know, early 90s or late 90s, early 2000s, of
Mm-hmm.
stories that were popular of my day. I don't know if this is the same time frame for you when you were in middle school, early high school, but I remember
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
like, oh, if you drink Mountain Dew and it's yellow 5, it'll like reduce your sperm count, so you shouldn't drink Mountain Dew. um, or like the tall tale of the guy who like did too much acid and now he thinks he's orange juice and he can't like lean over because he's afraid he'll like tip the orange juice out, kind of thing. Did you have stories like that when you like grew up? Were there like things that were that
Yeah.
way?
Yeah, like I remember same time period, like same years in like middle school as well, like these types of like urban legends, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, like this thing happens because of this. I saw and I cannot think of any good examples of what I remember like specifically from that era. The only thing I can remember is just like my parents always being like, "Hey, don't stand so close to the microwave; it'll like ruin your eyes or something."
Oh
Which
yeah.
maybe that one's, I don't know. I still to this day like keep my distance, like just. But I know what you're talking about, like these like random like urban legends, like if you do this, like then this will happen. And I feel like most of the ones I heard were just like, you remember when the movie The Ring came out?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like most of the ones were like people who were like trying to actually do what we do in the game, right? And just like be like, oh yeah, well something similar like that happened to my cousin where they got this like crazy, CD or like cassette and like this thing happened. And I think at the time I was kind of like, yeah, whatever. But it's kind of funny though, like because where the water tastes like wine focuses on this era of like tall tales, and it focuses
Mm-hmm.
on this era of just like these totally embellished stories where they aren't, I mean, they aren't real. I mean, they have a hint of truth to them, but they're really just, as one of the characters says a lot in the game, it's somebody spinning a good yarn.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's just, I think it's just funny how like that kind of tradition really persists, right? where
Yep.
we want to tell a good story, we want to entertain people, we want there to be like a hint of truth or like some sort of like connection to reality or to someone's own life experience, because it makes the person more interesting who's telling the story, right? And so I love this connection that you made, right? And I'm sorry I couldn't think of any good examples of urban legends, but like something similar was happening, and so I thought it was just like a really cool way to like make a video game about like that thing that we do in our culture, which is like tell good stories and really captivate an audience.
Yeah, totally. I think what's cool too with those stories that I was struck by, like those rumors I had from the 90s, I typed something like that into Google when I was playing this game because it was on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a
Mm-hmm.
Reddit thread of a whole bunch of people all around who had these same stories growing up. And, that's like the internet was around, but not like it's not like it is today. Like
Right.
in the early 2000s, I was using an AOL disk to get online. It wasn't like I was like online like I am now, or like in the game, these stories spreading. Like they don't have an internet connection. It's not like, oh, I saw this forum about
Mm-hmm.
whatever, one of the stories from here, and just that they can
Yeah.
spread everywhere. And I think that's so cool. Is that like even as the tall tale transforms, or it gets told, blah blah blah, but just that
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't even need something like an internet connection to do that. It just can,
Right.
which is like, what a power of story that like people who shouldn't know each other know the same story.
Yeah. You know what? I thought of one, and it's related to video games as you were talking about this. All of the rumors about how to catch Mew in Pokemon.
Ooh, yeah,
Uh,
that's a good
yeah,
one.
like Mew is hiding under the truck, like outside of Vermilion City in the SS Anne. And I remember just like spending like time. And it's funny because you bring up like Reddit and all these stories, but like back when we were in middle school, that was like the early age of the internet, where like people were posting like the craziest things about just like on like walkthroughs, or the early days of like IGN. I feel like just like people posting the craziest thing about video games, and then just like spending a ton of time like trying to find those secrets and just totally being duped.
Right. No, that's true. You really like would work for hours for a thing that wasn't even real. It was just a rumor or something that someone put on. That's so
Yeah.
funny. Yeah, you're right. It's funny. It's cool that this game was an embodiment of that. I
Yeah.
think that's pretty cool. So,
Hmm.
I feel like we've set the stage. Okay, I feel like this is what the game is. Hopefully, you have an idea of what it looks like. So, the big part outside of this is who you meet. So, in
Hmm.
general, you go and you meet stories. That's kind of a big thing that happens. But the other big thing that happens, which I would say is the Direwolf's like real request, is there are certain characters he wants you to meet, and you'll actually meet them multiple times. And so, all in all, there's 16 characters you meet through the game, scattered through the country, and you
Hmm.
end up having 3 or 4 meetings with them. So it might be like, oh, I met you outside of Oklahoma. We sat around for the night, camped together, swapped stories, and
Hmm.
then you ended up in New Mexico, and I found you there later, and we swapped stories again. That's sort
Hmm.
of your sort of setup. And all of these characters, most of them you meet 3 times. Some of them you get to meet 4 times.
Yeah, I thought this was really cool. When you would meet these characters and you have the dire wolf's request in mind, you're thinking, okay, how do we get to know this person? And all these people are reserved in one way or another. And I think like the big difference, like where the water tastes like wine, like versus like the urban legends and things we've kind of discussed now, is that these stories are very personal and very intimate to each of these characters. And so when you do get to the final stage of meeting them, I mean, they reveal something that's like really, really profound about themselves or about their worldview, about why they are the way they are. And a lot of times it'll reveal like why they're just kind of drifting through America as they're trying to find a place in America to be. They're running away from a place that has rejected them, or they're
Hmm.
on the road because the road is the closest thing that's felt like home. And I just thought that was a cool sort of thread that you get to the very end of them. or the end of each chapter. The right
Yep.
with each character, and part of that too is when you initially meet them, there's this really beautiful hand-drawn scenario. It's a campfire setting. It's nighttime, and you have this highly detailed person, and the fire will be like casting a shadow behind them, and the shadows
Mm-hmm.
flickering, and you have this great dialogue with them, and it's this wonderful character portrait. But when you unlock the final chapter, I was not prepared for this.
Yeah.
Um, and then you meet them for the final chapter, it completely changes, and it's not just the person's portrait, but it's like almost like a surrealist painting, like description, like painting or drawing of what this person's like true self is, like what they really are dealing with, and what their heart really looks like in a very cool artistic representation. And
Mm-hmm.
that to me was super fun, just like being able to see how the character portrait would change, and then just like taking in those detail. And I found myself constantly asking like, oh, like what are all the details here, like how does this reflect what they've expressed as what they're feeling and what their life really is like. That was an absolute highlight for me, meeting each of the characters and then getting to their final chapter.
Yeah, that was cool because it too, like their the story they told gave you details in the in chapter 1 and 2 or whatever, but then once
Hmm.
you get to that final form, it's like they, I don't know, bare their soul or whatever. It's like they
Yeah.
finally like throw it all out there. It's not just the here's a little bit of why I'm on the road and like what I might say around some friends. Instead, you get like the full thing, which is cool.
Right.
Like, and then to also have the visual to go with it is
Yeah.
super super cool. So okay, so we've got our 16 characters. I think the big thing worth doing is just kind of talking a little bit about their story and I don't know, maybe things that stood out to us about it. Of course,
Hmm.
with this, since it's the open world thing, people could meet all of these characters in a variety of ways, really, because depending where you go first and all that is who you might meet. But the
Hmm.
kind of list I was working through, this wasn't the order I met them in either, but the first person, though, that I wanted to talk about was Cassidy. And so
Hmm.
Cassidy is a guy who's a beat poet, and he's on the road trying to get over the ex-love of his life, a guy named Silas. And he basically, like, is sort of your tortured soul of sorts,
Yes.
of like, hey, I feel sad, and my life feels sad right now. Could you tell me more sad stories? I want to be in that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And as you go through, the kind of big things you find out about his story is he was kind of a drifter with a group of artists of sorts, of people who were, beat poets and writers and all of that stuff.
Hmm.
And in there, there was like a crew of them, and he was with Silas at that time. Or maybe they were in sort of a cumulative relationship with several people.
Right.
But then at some point, Silas left with one of those friends and was like, I'm going to be married to her and just try to lead like a quote unquote regular life. And
Yeah.
so Cassidy feels really disregarded and is like, well, I can't get over how I feel about this, but I can't be where we were, so I'm just going to drift until I feel differently, basically.
Yeah, his story was a really fascinating, I think. And I think his story, like many of the others that we listen to, is one where we I think we consider things like people being openly gay like to be brand new ideas, and I found it really refreshing to listen to his story, because like homosexuality, for example, is something that's like not new. It's been around forever, and so
Mm-hmm.
you could kind of tell that in his story. At first, he's being a little reserved about who the ex love of his life is. You just think that they're good friends, but as he reveals more and more of himself, you realize no, that these people were in love, and his heart was broken. And he's always asking for tragic stories. Poor guy. But I thought that was like a cool thing, because to me, like his story in particular, like really represented like the evolution of like trust that you gained with him as he was bearing more of his soul with you, and as you learned more about him, his I thought was a really good story. Really good story. And I thought his character was written super well. This is somebody who is a poet who is, constantly writing poetry. And some of his comments to your stories is like, wow, that's something that you need to write down. Or like, wow, that really could be distilled into a poem beautifully. And I just thought that it was a cool perspective when he was having the conversation, because this game's about stories. And so to have like a writer within the game, like make comments about your stories and the stories that you're telling, I thought were really cool. Like to me, it was almost like if you were to submit a story and like get feedback from an editor, like that's what Cassidy kind of was also as well. But yeah, his story, like despite his talents and despite his abilities, is just one of heartbreak. And I loved the conclusion with him because he has more of a resolve to let his heart mend, but at the same time, this is obviously a burden that he will have to carry with him for the rest of his life.
Yeah, no, totally. I guess also, actually, as a side point, for each of these characters you meet, they actually have a different writer for each of these stories. So there's, 16 writers of these stories throughout the game, and then also a different voice actor for them. So it's pretty cool is just how... I imagine putting this game together was an interesting feat in itself with that in mind.
Yes. Yeah, I noticed that as well, too. Like, every time you meet a character, it would say, the character's name, like what chapter you were on, and then it would actually list the writer's name, like the person outside the game who wrote the story and they wrote that character. And in that way, it really did feel like a collection of short stories or an anthology, just like having the writer's credit like so plain and obvious every time that you met a character. So I thought that was a really cool detail to include.
Yeah, I did too. It felt like you said, if you picked up a book of short stories with a bunch of different authors or something like that. Like, really cool idea. Yeah, for sure. Our second character that I wanted to talk about is Fidelina. And so she, you meet her in the Southwest, and she's a Mexican immigrant who is trying to find someone to pass her knowledge on to. So we find out that she's like a healer and sort of a magic type thing. And as the world becomes more like medicine focused and doctors and stuff like that, she starts to be kind of cast aside in her culture. And as it goes on, you find out that she has a daughter who was supposed to be a healer. Like, she was supposed to have, I don't know, whatever traits you would have to be a healer. But her daughter was cursed by a witch, so she lost those potential powers. And so now kind of her mission essentially is, I need to pass on what I learned before I die. And that's sort of what you meet her in.
Yeah, I feel like Fidelina, like a lot of, like this story that you've summarized so well, like about her, she has something that she wants to pass on, and she's afraid that her knowledge and her culture is like hitting a dead end. And it's really, really fascinating to sort of see like the cultural aspects that she brings to healing, to like home remedies and home treatments. And I mean that not in like a disparaging way, but like you said, like in Fidelina, I think we see this really big contrast between like industrialized and standardized medicine and medicinal practice versus like traditional healing methods. And her story was, hers and somebody else that we're going to talk to, I feel like there's just so much, despite the character themselves being somebody who is like really joyful and has like a really uplifting demeanor, was like, I felt like the sadness of just like all of this knowledge that I've accumulated cannot die with me. And that like urgency to pass it on. I thought that was illustrated really beautifully with them. And I thought Fidelina was really cool. I also loved her, this is maybe more of a silly note, because she would quite often ask for stories about ghosts or witches, which I had many stories.
Yeah. It's like, you're with the right person. I have those.
Yeah. Every time she would ask for like, do you have any stories about like somebody practicing the devil's art? I was like, boy, howdy, do I have like a few stories for you. Yeah, but so that's a bit of a lighter note, just my interaction with her. But yeah, I loved her story. I just thought this urgency to pass on knowledge and like the sadness that kind of comes with that, of just thinking like, if I can't find somebody to teach everything I know about, somebody who's willing to learn, somebody who wants to learn, then this is going to go away. And I think in the case of Fidelina, like you mentioned, this is somebody who's originally from Mexico. Like they've moved to the United States, like for various life circumstances, but they're kind of willing to find anybody at this point. And so I felt that sort of desperation in her really strongly.
Yeah, yeah, totally. She was it was like the last thing she had to do for sure.
Yeah.
I think in a similar note to our next character is a guy named Ray, who's this cowboy who's basically fighting against industrialization. So you kind of meet him, and I think around Oklahoma area, and he is kind of on the run because he's been tearing down like fences and things like that, because he's like, no, it's the West, we should be free. I feel like he's like someone who would fit in like the Red Dead Redemption world, of like
Yes.
I've lived in kind of the quote unquote Wild West, and now like all these people from out east are coming and changing things, and they're putting trains here, and they're trying to make rules, and like there's not supposed to be rules here, it's the land, like that kind of thing. And I think even we talked about this earlier, but really the theme for him, but a lot of these is just that rejection of like society is rejecting you now that you're not the way society wants it. It's like Ray was probably content in the Wild West or whatever, but it's like, well, no, the world's industrialized now. You don't have a place in it anymore. Or for Fidelina before that, right? A healer was really valuable, but hey, we have medicines, we have hospital, whatever. We don't need you anymore. Like,
right.
You get that a lot. Or for Cassidy, well, I have this new partner. I don't need you anymore. And so you have so much of that in these of people's, rejection or feeling on the outside looking in.
Yeah. Yeah, I had the exact same thought that you did about Ray. Like, Ray could have been in the Vanderlyn gang from like Red Dead Redemption 2, because this is somebody who is clearly an outcast, somebody who's willing to break the law, somebody who is really upset that the notion of what the Wild West was is no longer there. Like, the West is tame now. And I think part of this too, this doesn't factor too much into his story directly, like at all directly. But I think the circumstances of being like Depression era, Dust Bowl era America is like, for people like Ray, they've seen what like industrialized warfare can do after World War I. And to me, as I've thought about literary movements that are happening during this time across the world, one is, the avant-garde movement. And there's this great or massive like disillusion or deception with World War One. I was like, how is it that as like a now globalized planet that we could so brutally kill each other? And this is what our technology is doing. And it's a really tragic, reflective moment in literature. And so while Ray isn't necessarily, talking about that on a global scale, for him, it's like, well, this home that I've had, this Wild West, and his notion of what liberty and freedom are, this is all going away based, because of industrialization. Industrialization is something, it's a great evil. It destroys people. And that's kind of where this background is coming from. But Ray definitely would have had a kindred spirit, I think, with Dutch for sure. There is so much that I saw in common between them.
Yeah, 100%. Our next character is Bertha. As a side point, she's voiced by Cissy Jones, who you might know as Delilah from Firewatch. She was also in Life is Strange as Joyce. She was in Katja and Telltale's Walking Dead. So she's done a lot of stuff, but she's Bertha in this game, which was cool. Is that, I know you sort of feel. And her story is she's a Dust Bowl refugee. So once Oklahoma got bad, she headed out west and tried to make it as a like sharecropper or like picker of things. in California, and she got to this spot where her husband just felt like so disrespected being in California. I think people treating you bad as kind of a Dust Bowl refugee, as someone who's having difficulties, all of that. And
Yeah.
he finally stormed off one day and took her family and went back to Oklahoma and was like, I would rather die here, suffering than be disrespected here any longer. But
Right.
she, got left behind, but is like, no, I think that we could still, she thought we could still find a way to make it work here, even though it sucks.
Yeah, she was one of the more interesting characters for me in terms of like how her life was directly impacted by the depression. And of course, all of the characters here, indirectly they're being impacted by what's happening in the United States, and there are plenty of historical references to things going on here. But as somebody who like was is literally a Dust Bowl refugee from Oklahoma, I thought it was cool to have her character in the game, just to be like, okay, we're talking about this era. Here's like the major event that really defines a huge chunk of this era, and this is like what happened to a lot of people who are living in Oklahoma at the time. And so I found her character, I guess what I'm trying to say really is that her character to me felt like the most historical, in the sense of like what was directly happening to people affected by the Dust Bowl, and what that meant in terms of like migration and moving within the United States because of this, massive problem. And so I liked her character a lot for that. Other characters are very historical in different ways, but I think in terms of like really big defining events of the time period, Bertha felt like the one who really represented that.
Yep. Oh yeah, definitely. And I think most felt to me like that Steinbeck identification, right? Because of the
Yeah.
is it it's not East of Eden, it's the other one where they go west. In the Dust Bowl, and they all pack their cars in, and there's dust everywhere as they're leaving.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one very much so encapsulates that for sure. Then we've got August. August is a guy you meet who initially looks kind of like a burly sailor kind of guy with tattoos and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And as he's telling his story, you find out that as a child, he like read a bunch of books, and his dad always like punished him for it. It was bad, and he kind of says, reading all those books made my eyesight my eyesight bad. And so when when the war broke out, World War I, I tried to go to the army, and they said, no, you can't come. Like, you have bad eyesight. You can't be a soldier. And so he ended up being able to join the Merchant Marines, so kind of snuck his way around to join the war. And, he developed camaraderie there, all that stuff. But then at one point, his entire crew that he's with on his ship, they all get killed, and it destroys his eyesight completely. And so now he's just kind of drifting as a person who has really no one at all, and has even seen rejection before this like final, I don't know, tragedy for him.
Yeah, if we were to make like another category of some of these characters, I feel like August definitely fits in with the crowd of like something happened to their physical ability to perform like labor, like physical labor, and there was never a support system to help them do something else with their life. Never to help them, whether like just receive help at all, period, or find different ways of working or whatever it was. And so he had this really interesting line where he said, like, eventually, the army rejected me, my wife and kids rejected me, and the only thing that wouldn't reject me was a bottle, like, to drink. And he became a severe alcoholic. He said he said something along the lines of like, I never needed my eyes to find the bottle, right? Like, it was really easy to find the bottle with his lips. And that to me was just like such a sad moment of like, August has been sort of pushed to like, well, this is how I have to cope. Like, apparently, like, I'm just fitting along with the theme of rejection. Like, him is like very much like an ableist rejection. Like, his body doesn't operate the way that it should, or it doesn't really fit in with traditional labor. well, good luck, man. And so he's just out drifting
Yeah.
across America.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's so sad to see. Yeah, that one's pretty brutal.
Yeah, that one was brutal in that way.
Yeah. And the brutalness continues. Really, all of these people have largely sad stories, and sometimes there's moments of hope, but a lot of them are pretty sad. And
Yeah.
like you said at the beginning, I think is pretty reflective of this era of history. Like, I don't know that there are a lot of people that were pretty stoked about life all the time then. um,
Right.
it seems like it was pretty hard.
Mm-hmm.
But our next person is Dehaya, and she is a member of the Navajo tribe, and she was actually forced to leave her land in the Long Walk. So the military said, "No, this is our land. You can't go here. We're sending you to this reservation." And then she talks about a time later on where the U.S. government said, "Hey, actually, you can or need to leave this reservation and go back to where you were originally from, and
Yeah.
maybe that's the new reservation. Maybe you're just allowed to go back." I was a little unclear on that, but either way, she does end up heading back there and is kind of recounting this. And there's sort of this like, the land was holy, and so I want to return to it, but also like there's a lot of trauma and hardship that surrounded this whole thing because it was horrible.
Yeah, I think hers was another like really historical character in the sense of this is somebody like, okay, what happened to the people who were forced to leave the land in the Long Walk, and what what became of them? And I thought her story was really powerful in that way. There's this really beautiful moment when she talks about, and this is in her final chapter, which by the way, her physical, like her not physical but like her, I don't know what we want to say, like spiritual or soul artistic representation was her homeland. And it was like these four peaks, these four like mountain peaks that had spiritual significance to her, which I thought was really cool. But she says this really really neat thing where she says that walking back she was afraid that the land, like what if the land rejected me, what if the land had moved on, what if the land didn't recognize me. And I just thought that was really cool, just like being able to catch a glimpse of like, okay, for her, like what was the land and how forceful was really uprooting these people and making them go somewhere else where they had no attachment, where they had never lived, where generations past, like they don't have any connection to this land, when the connection to land for her was so significant. And I thought it was really cool seeing that in her artistic soul portrait. I guess that's what I'm just going to call it now.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really cool. And hers actually ends with something that sounded really poetic, where like, may I walk in the beauty, may the beauty walk above me, may the beauty walk alongside of me. And I'm paraphrasing here. But to me, it sort of felt like it communicated well what it meant to return to her homeland and try to reestablish that connection.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really cool. I thought that was something that, like you mentioned, that the story told really well too, of that whole stuff was horrible, obviously, but like clearly a horrible thing to do that the United States did then. But even just it wasn't just shitty of like, hey, this was your place, it's not anymore, you have to go to this other place we decided for you. But it's like, no, this like connection to the land, all of these things, it's even more than just the on the face kind of
Right.
shittiness you'd observe or whatever. Like it's more than that, which is I thought that this really displayed that in a way that I hadn't like thought that hard about before.
Yeah. I mean, that's really what it was. And I think one of her stories was probably one of the most powerful for me in that way, because I felt like a lot of the other stories, maybe I had heard or maybe read something about that historical event and maybe had like a vague idea of what those people went through. But I feel like for her, like I very much learned from this experience, oh, like this is what these people had to deal with. And this is way more significant. And it was told in such a way that, I mean, it was good storytelling in the sense that it really educated me, like, oh, wow, So this is exactly why this was hard. It's because this literal like uprooting from the land had really spiritual consequences for these people. Wow, that's way more significant than just the way that I've heard it previously, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Um, our next character is Rose. She's voiced by Sarah Elmala. She was Katie in Gone Home. She was also Apollyon in After Party, so she's been around in some things. This one was also the one written by Johanneman Nordhagen, so I don't know. I took note of that. This one got 4 chapters. It was one of the couple that got 4.
Yeah.
And her story overall is she was a hippie. I think she tried to show up for like the Summer of Love, but was a little late. And then kind of fell in with a bunch of people who followed around the Grateful Dead, and like had a significant other who was part of that, followed the Grateful Dead around for a couple years, and then kind of finally like joined a commune after that, and then ended up being a drifter, and that's how you met her. But so she's had certainly an interesting life.
Yes, yeah, I felt like hers was was quite unique compared to the other ones. I didn't feel like the same level of like tragedy, like you said. Like we've kind of been going through it as we've been,
Yep.
talking about each of these characters. I wouldn't necessarily say that Rose was like really lighthearted, but it was definitely not nearly as like sad. Which honestly, sometimes when you're like knee deep in things that are just really sad all the time, it's really refreshing, to have, the comic relief in there. That's why it's, in movies and in books everywhere. And so I thought hers was super interesting in that way, right? This was a very different character. I think you first meet her like outside of Portland.
I think you're right.
Mistaken. Maybe in California. I might be getting her. I'm pretty sure it's Portland. But yeah, I mean, I really liked hers because it was just different. It was refreshing to get a different story in there.
Yeah, I agree. Because you're right. Most of them have been more tragic in nature, with some hope sprinkled in. And it was nice to get something that was just kind of different from that, where it was, I don't know, experiences and stuff like that, but it wasn't just sad.
Right.
So yeah, I agree. She was nice to meet because of that. Our next one adds more tragedy, though, as a lot of them do, which is a guy named Little Ben, and you meet him, I think, in like the West Virginia type area. And he'd worked as a union miner, and you find out that like he kind of has to drift because people like beat him up for being in the union, kind of thing. Like one of your early meetings, he's like, "Hey, it'd be best if you say you don't know me and I don't know you, because like I don't want you to get beat up for being around someone who supports the union."
Right.
Like it's kind of wild. And then as his story like culminates, he tells you about his brother, who I guess was called Big Ben, which is, I don't know, a lot to unpack in itself.
Yes.
But his older brother, I guess, seemingly died in a mining accident when he was like 10. So he was like a child, but forced to work in the mines, and something bad happened and he died. And Little Ben is basically like living in this shadow of his brother. Like he doesn't go by Ben. Like he still calls himself Little Ben, and like feels like he's in his brother's shadow. And I don't know, maybe being part of the union, it's like he wants to try to do this the right way so kids don't die in mines, but like it's just all around pretty rough.
Yeah, his was really, really tragic in a lot of ways. And like you mentioned, like this relationship, with his brother, with Big Ben, is what he talks about a lot at, in the first chapters, I feel like. And so I kind of at first was like, oh, Little Ben, like he's dealing with this grief and trauma, and he hasn't really been able to reconcile it. And it's just, it was really sad. But as I was listening to his story more and more, like I feel like if the story in the foreground is the relationship with his brother, the story in the background is like how devastating mining work conditions really were. And it's because those work conditions sucked so much that they claim the lives of many people, including his brother. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that, in addition to trying to, live with the burden of that type of, really close loss in your life, he's trying to deal with like the political ramifications of what that means for like labor rights and what that means for just, working in a mine generally. In his story, I thought a lot of the book of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair,
Mm.
which that book, oof. I mean, if you like the tragedy here, I mean, go read the Jungle. Also, very tragic, but in the sense of the Jungle is really about labor conditions before World War One, so it's a slightly different time period. And that book is very much advocating for labor rights and workers' rights generally, and clean and healthy and safe work conditions. And I feel like Little Ben's story very much reflected those themes where, hey, like deep down in a mine, who is going to go down there and inspect that this is really safe? Who's going to go down there and like make sure that all the
Mm-hmm.
rules are being kept? And the answer is no one. I mean, no one's really doing that. And Little Ben is, fighting to just try to survive. And yeah, and that's why he joined the union, right? He wants to make those changes happen and he wants to be a part of those changes. But a lot of people don't like that. They don't like that idea. They want the status quo to continue as it is. And so Little Ben, very much for me, is one of the characters that I thought was really emblematic of like the worker struggle and how there wasn't a lot of protection for workers.
Yeah, totally. Have you played Kentucky Route Zero?
Oh my gosh. No.
No?
I'm like
Okay.
embarrassed. I'm like embarrassed to say it because I have it on my home screen of my Xbox, and like every day I look at it and I'm like, I need to start this game. And then the Annapurna Interactive, the devs from Kentucky Route Zero came on and they said that they're working on something new, and I was like, no, now I really have to
That
play it. So I'm embarrassed to say it, but no.
that no, that's okay. I played it last year, but there is a part where similar working conditions. There's a part that comes up in that game that is reminiscent of that. And this game, I would say, of games I could compare to this game, Kentucky Route Zero would be one in that realm for sure. So
Gotcha.
if you end up in a spot down the line where you're like, I really want some of the more things that you get from this game, Kentucky Route Zero is definitely a good
All right. I
good
need
thing
to do it. Yeah.
whenever you want to scratch that itch again,
Mm-hmm.
because it totally hits that. But that I felt that with this too. I was like, ooh, this reminds me of Kentucky Route Zero, and other things did too, but this Little Ben specifically did as well.
Okay.
Our next character, more tragedy, is Quinn. Quinn's like a teenage boy who's voiced by Melissa Hutchison, who people might know as Clementine in Telltale's Walking Dead, or TJ in The Wolf Among Us. So, again, familiar voice. And Quinn is probably the person most people met first, because Quinn starts out in Northeast, maybe Boston, maybe even before that. Like, you meet Quinn very early.
Yeah, very early. I almost want to say like Southern Maine. Like he might just be right near the start.
Yeah, it is very, very early. And Quinn is, this middle school aged kid who's just drifting. And at first they're just like, hey, tell me a scary story. Nothing scares me because I'm basically an adult. And you're like, all right. Things like that. And finally, as the game goes on, they open up to you and you find out that their family basically said, hey, you can't live on the farm anymore. Like, we've hit hard times, and can't afford things. So see ya. Good luck, kind of thing. And one of the things that they said that like stood out to me was they had a younger sibling that was left back home, and a kind of reflection they had in their last chapter was like, I don't know if I'm like happy for them that, maybe they had a life that worked out and they don't know about this, or I don't know if I'm pissed about it and that like I hope that they also have a bad life because I didn't deserve this. Like there's sort of a comment in the realm, and it was like that's interesting. That would be a pretty complicated way to feel.
Yeah, I mean, when I first ran into Quinn, I definitely kind of thought that this like, oh, this is like, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, somebody just kind of out on the road. Like I kind of thought of him as like more of a runaway, right? And then as you get to his final chapter, and it's cool because, Quinn is one of the character portraits that's really interesting. You really can't see Quinn's face very well. Quinn's got this like big straw hat. There's a shadow that's kind of covering his eyes. He's there with his two dogs, and I'm forgetting their name. And then his character portrait is really a lot scarier than I thought it would be. It's like this. It's like this big, like almost hooded figure. You really can't see the face at all. I feel like his hands are skeletal, and his dogs are like inside what looks like this big robe or like almost trench coat type of thing. And then when he finally starts telling his story, and the part that you mentioned, right, where he's no runaway, right? He was kicked off the farm like as a like middle school age, and his parents basically just said, yeah, we're kind of done with you. And then he talks about how he had a baby sister at the time, and I love the way that you summarized it. I think you summarized it super well, but really just like those really complicated feelings that he has to deal with. Like he knows about this baby sister, and you can kind of tell and feel that this is somebody that he really loved and then was just like forced to be away from because of his parents of all people. And so just like all that ugly, complicated feelings that he has to kind of travel with. And I kind of left his story like being glad that Quinn was able to make a better life for himself. And then at the same time, it was very bittersweet, just sad that he was forced to do that. And so I think his character portrait to me like kind of represented somebody who, I thought he was all talk about when he was talking about how he's tough and, roughing it out in the wild. But his character portrait just like being super big, like a really big presence, like much bigger than Quinn is. I was like, yeah, this is somebody who was kind of forced to grow up in like a really terrible way. And I thought the character portrait like represented that pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. That was the portrait I think I was most surprised by, of what you got versus what you started with. You're like, oh, this is different than I expected. Our next character is Dupree. She's a grifter, basically, and you find out that she kind of is lying along the way, and in your like second to last meeting, she ends up stealing from you.
Yes.
And so a lot of her stuff is like that she just talks big. I would say that that's her main thing, is she talks big and like, that sort of thing. And it seems to be kind of involved in the, exciting life as she's like grifting and doing grifting related things.
Yeah. I think like at this point, like it's very obvious to feel sympathy for a lot of these characters. Like after Dupree like robbed me, I was like, I don't know if I feel that much sympathy for you anymore. And I'm her like final character portrait too was somebody who looked like very lavish and cunning, right? And she was the one character that I think was really different from all the others in that I was like, she has had a tragic life, but she is equally doling out tragedy to other people. And so, and part of it is like, how much do we really blame Dupree for this, right? She just has to get by also. And she has to overcome obstacles like any one of us, but she is also willing to dish it out too. And so I thought she was just kind of, I don't know. I just thought she was a really different character in that way, where I didn't feel like a whole lot of empathy for her, but at the same time I thought to myself, she's still living a hard life and she still has to deal with a lot of the hardness that these other characters are dealing with.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. She sort of stood out in that way for sure. Next up we got Jimmy. Jimmy is a guy who lied about his age to get into World War I. He was 17, but he enlisted. And when he enlisted, he was like, oh yeah, I'm a preacher. So he became like a chaplain. And in fact, he was a part of like a famous black regiment in the war. who was kind of known. And so he was in World War One, and then when he got back, he just kept preaching. So he was never a preacher when he entered World War One, but he just kind of rolled with that. And you can even tell he's a pretty good speaker and engaging in that way. And I think he just said it, and people believed him. And he's basically made his living being that way. And so he's been a traveling preacher since then. And something he comments on part of the way through is like, yeah, I don't really know what I believe. You know, I go to churches, and whatever kind of church they are and who they need, that's what I am. So, you know, I'm Baptist a lot. Sometimes I'm Presbyterian. I've even been Catholic before. It's what the people need, and I try to tell the stories that people need to hear. Sort of thing. And so he's pretty interesting in that way of again, a kind of different character. Not necessarily tragedy in him. He's almost he's not malintent like Dupree is, but he's sort of a kindred spirit in that, I would say.
Yeah, it's funny because you get the confession of the preacher like at the end of his story, and it's about how he's not a preacher and he's lied and all these things. I think you're right though. Like he is a kindred spirit to Dupree in that way, right? Where he is, I don't know. It's like he's a lot like her in that he's kind of lying with most of everything that he's doing. But he's the big difference, obviously, between him and her is that he's like conning people to do good to them.
Right.
Yeah, and you're right. Like he's not really, like he's suffered a lot, and he mentions, you know, when he was in the Black Regiment, World War One, he was like, the U.S. government didn't even want us. You know, they sent us over to the French. Like, and the French were the ones that gave all the orders and was in charge of that regiment. But yeah, I think it's really interesting for him. I think he's like a great example of like, he might not even be like a Christian. Like he might not even believe in God, but he definitely believes in the idea of like Christian goodwill, you know, like do good unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so he's like all about like that message and that attitude. And he is traveling with that purpose to help people out. And a lot of times it's like in a religious context. Sometimes it's like, yeah, we're going to baptize people and I'll just go help baptize the people. But I felt like for him, he felt like he was doing so much good and he was helping people find reconciliation, like through religion, even if he didn't believe it, in times where people were feeling rejected and sort of needed some type of peace. So I felt like he just like fulfilled this role, like, hey, religion's supposed to give people peace. That's something that I can do, even if I don't believe it. And so that's what he did.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Conning for good. that comment you mentioned. It's so interesting because it's like his life could probably be easier, and if I don't know if he did something else, if he having to be like a traveling preacher, but it's for other people's good. It's just such an interesting guy that you meet along the way compared to a lot of other people. He's notably different in some ways. Yeah. Our next guy is a guy named Franklin. His story, I think I mostly remember what he did as opposed to some of his story, but he's a porter, which is like a railroad company worker. The big thing I think I remember is like his sort of loyalty to the company, but then sort of the difficulties you have with being someone who, he's not in customer service exactly, but kind of your challenges of that. That was the big thing I kind of took from him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I felt like his went parallel with somebody else that we're still going to talk about. Franklin, like as a porter, he talks a lot about the racism that he has to deal with, but he's in a position, like you said, where it's like kind of customer service. It's not the same as like the really like labor intensive positions that a lot of Black people found themselves in, and all the suffering, like literal, physical, and the racism that they felt. And so for me, it almost felt like Franklin was sort of represented like that kind of transition towards the civil rights movement, where this is a
Mm,
black person who's like in a very public, and he's in white spaces a lot, and so he's just dealing with racism in different ways. And so I thought he was an interesting character for that, for sure.
yeah, totally. No, that's good. And then we've got Mason. Mason was a soldier in World War One who lost his leg during the war, and also his brother was killed during the war.
Mm-hmm.
And when he gets home, his family rejects him. He talks about his sister, and who basically like kind of blames him, like your brother died while you were out there. This is your fault. I'm cutting off from you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then he also experiences his country rejecting him. That that we don't, the government doesn't care about wounded soldiers. We cared about you while you were over there, quote unquote. Now that you're here, like stay out of the way, basically,
Yeah.
and we don't care what happens to you. And his like hopeful moment, I would say, or like where you could see him be proud, is when he like marched on Washington with other vets who'd been rejected, and were like, you need to give us this payment that you said you would, like this is wrong, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so his story was tragic, but I did feel like there was some hope in that as he got to like stand for an ideal.
Yeah, I think him versus a lot of the other characters in this game, he definitely had a moment where he could voice his frustrations and show resolve towards change. Where like
Mm-hmm.
most people here are just like beaten down by the way things are,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to suffer those tragedies, and they just have to figure out a way to get by. But yeah, Mason was super interesting because he was a soldier. And then he mentions at one point that it was his identical twin, I think, that was
Yeah.
killed. And that for him was really difficult because they were close. And his final, character portrait, his artistic soul portrait, is like a person torn in half. And one
Yeah.
half it's him, in his military uniform, with his leg, and the other half is like him as a drifter now. And I just thought that was really cool because I thought it represented really well, just like he wanted so badly to like belong to something, but all those things that he was trying to cling on to, like his family, the army, the government, they all pushed him so far away. And so I like that sort of visual representation of him being torn. And then I think you said it really well. Like that moment of sort of like optimism or hope or a resolve is like when he talks about how he marched on Washington and how he was trying to advocate for change, and he was trying to get the government to like recognize like what exactly the war had done to vets.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that was a really cool moment for him, and for us as we got to experience that part of his story.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I thought that was, and he's one of your early people you can meet too. I think he's on the East Coast area too, so he was someone I met early on,
Yeah.
which is cool. Our next person is Shaw. He's voiced by Dave Fennoy, who was Lee in Telltale's Walking Dead. He was Okir in Mass Effect 2. He's Satan in After Party. He's great. He was maybe my favorite character to talk to because his voice actor has such a great voice.
Oh yeah.
He's so good. Absolutely perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And so Shaw is a guy who was a sharecropper who lived in the South and had experienced a lot of racism and suffering and things that went along with that. And one thing that stood out in his story to me was he had a son who lived in Chicago and was like, you should come up here. They treat us really well.
Mm-hmm.
It's totally different than in the South. And then he describes this experience of getting to Chicago and at first seeing, oh, wow, like there is more opportunity here, whatever. But then as time goes on, it's like, oh, these white people are also shitty, just in a different way.
Yeah.
And, it looks different, but it still sucks. And just that this suffering has continued even in a new place that seemed different, sort of thing. So, yeah, his story was pretty sad. A lot of hardship as well.
Yeah, this is the story that I was thinking of that like works pretty well in parallel with Franklin's story. I think with Shaw's story, though, it's a bit more obvious, when he talks about dealing with racism and how that's impacted him. And yeah, I mean, you shared the moment that I was thinking of too. He was, invited to go up north, right? And hey, it's better here. And it's actually just a different kind of bad. And so you just kind of choose, what kind of bad you want to deal with. I think Shaw for me definitely represented like the Jim Crow laws, right? And how after the Civil War, things didn't magically get better for Black people, and how they're still dealing with, I mean, they're dealing with Jim Crow, and they're dealing with those types of cultural norms and attitudes and literal laws that are still written against them.
Yeah. So on to our final two. We've gone through quite a few characters. One I have a little less information on, so I figure hit up first, is Rocio. And so she's a migrant worker. And her story, to be honest, I feel a little more fuzzy with, but I feel like her kindred spirit would be Bertha with the Dust Bowl. It seemed like sort of the same thing of like trying to get work and face struggle with being a, I don't know, struggle with being rejected kind of by the people who are employing you or whatever. That's the big thing I remember. Do you remember more details on that one? For some reason, that one was fuzzy for me.
Yeah, hers, I felt like hers was always one of the hardest ones for me because she was always asking for funny stories. And so hers, I felt like I came back to a lot just like because of the game mechanics, and I was really struggling to progress her story. Yeah, so she to me, I saw some similarity with Fidelina also, in that this is somebody who has roots or has heritage that's not from the United States, but this is somebody who is sort of juggling, that heritage, but also living in the States. To me, this is somebody who, we actually just went over this in one of my classes when we were talking about like the history of immigration from Latin America to the United States in the 20th century. And when people talk about Latin American immigration to the United States and to Canada, and now they talk about it as something that's like kind of new from the 90s, when in reality, throughout the 20th century in particular, there's been tons of immigration. And at one point, so this is a little after this time, but during World War II, we're all very familiar with the Rosie the Riveter, image. Yes, we can, right? During that time, the United States had very lax immigration laws, and just to get a bunch of Latin American men to come work the positions that a lot of the men who were out fighting had vacated. And so during that time, for example, there was this like huge wave of immigration. But before then, which is the time we're dealing with here, is during the Depression, there were very strict immigration laws, and it was really difficult for somebody of Latin American descent to find a place in the United States. And it was very much a mentality of, hey, we need to take care of our own. We can't take care of you. Why are you here? And it's very similar rhetoric to what we hear now about like, oh, these people are going to come and they're going to steal our jobs, and it's going to be this big problem. And so I feel like her story kind of reflects a little bit of that. This is somebody who is well versed in multiple cultures, but it finds themselves in the United States right now and sort of just has to grapple with, okay, how do I make a place here? This place doesn't really want me, but I'm not going back to Latin America. That's not exactly where her place is either. Yeah, I mean, during this time period, I feel like there are a lot of people from Latino descent who are struggling with some of those issues. And I just think that she definitely represented that. But like I said, she was one of the more difficult characters for me to progress her story anyway. And so I felt like I was getting a lot of dead ends with what she was trying to tell me in each time I met her in each chapter.
Yeah. No, yeah, that makes sense. That something you said there too that I think is notable is with what's going on now today, and I felt that a lot through this whole game. Is there are all these issues that were prevalent 100 years ago, ish, maybe a little
Mm-hmm.
less, um, and unfortunately, a lot of them still resonate in their own ways. Some of them are like, yeah, it's the same, and some of them are a little better or a little worse, or that kind of thing. But
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. That stood out to me as obviously or this game, came out a couple of years ago, so it's not old in terms of who wrote it, but the
Right.
struggles felt very probably accurate to what was going on then, but then
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately pretty relatable to life now too, and that feeling of rejection by your family, your country, your working conditions, whatever.
Right.
These people are experiencing similar things to a lot of what happens now.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I think the game was really well done in that regard. Right. Where you play it, and we were playing it in 2022, and it's like, wow, this game is supposed to be taking place like nearly 100 years ago. How much has really changed since then,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it made you feel that way, and some of them you're like, ooh, this is not good. This is bad. Like,
Yeah.
um, like with Mason or August, like people who were veterans that are just rejected and the country doesn't care anymore. Like that's been
Right.
all over the news the last few years,
Right. Yeah.
with
Yeah.
with different bills that have shown up and things like that. And you're like, that sucks. Like there's probably a modern day equivalent to what these guys are doing right now. Like of what
Right.
Mason would be. He's probably not drifting on railroads now today, but there's probably something that's similar. And it's like, oh man,
Yeah.
that sucks that we haven't gotten better as a country in some of
Right.
these things.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last character though is Althea. Althea is a blues singer, and she got signed when she was young to a label. And at first, she kind of did it like, I always wanted to do the blues, but I'm also doing this to support my family, my brother, my younger brother, who I'm close with. Like, this is going to be good for him. And then,
Mm-hmm.
kind of as time went, being a blues musician, she lost roots at home. I think she was from Memphis, maybe, and she stopped going back. She, stopped even thinking about her brother because she was caught up in the blues. And
Mm-hmm.
then later on, her story kind of culminates in this spot where her record label contract ends and she's sort of trying to figure out what's next. And she manages to strike a deal with the devil and say, I will, give my soul to you or whatever if you make me the best blues musician of all time.
Mm-hmm.
And the devil's like, yeah, I got you. Um, and she has this huge influence, like the way she plays guitar, the way she sings, it like defines blues music. If anyone in blues that you knew about, Althea was, one of my key influences, that sort of thing. But then,
Mm-hmm.
of course, signing a deal with the devil has the other side. And the other side
Mm-hmm.
is blues fell out of favor. No one cares about blues. So she was super influential for a short spot. And then after that, she's just a person playing guitar in the streets to try to make money. Like this, ultimate, I don't know, crash and burn in terms of fame sort
Yeah.
of thing after this ill-fated deal.
Yeah, her story also a little unique. I mean, obviously, there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of tragedy in her story. It feels like really personal tragedy in her story compared to all the other ones, right? Since we're on this task from the dire wolf to find true stories. Hers was definitely the one that felt the most like fantastical or supernatural out of all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a for me it just resonated a little differently, right? Like I didn't walk away feeling like great sympathy or necessarily sadness because to me hers felt more like a story rather than like a personal intimate history. But I mean nonetheless, I mean it was still a really cool story and I think it resonated like pretty well with the time era and like tall tales and obviously with our character, right, who we are making weird deals with shady people. Um,
Yeah.
and so her story definitely for me made me probably think more about like what I was doing as the player, as the protagonist, right, in this story. What and I it kind of made me wonder like what exactly did I get into here with Direwolf?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. I like that she was a difference in there of like the more fantastical story. I thought that was
Mm-hmm.
cool to kind of have that among these. So, um, okay, so these are all our characters. We've gone in depth with them. As we said, you meet them 3 or 4 times, and once you actually meet all of them, you collect their stories. You can then return to the direwolf, and you see the direwolf as a spot on your map as someone to go to, and you can go to the direwolf and be like, "I've completed my task. I've collected all these true stories that you wanted."
Mm-hmm.
And also, I guess along the way, you can die and give the direwolf stories along the way, which is unusual. I didn't expect being able to die in this game, but you can. But kind of in conclusion, you get to share the story with the direwolf, and he basically is like, okay, you found these stories so they can live on, right? That's kind of his main thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's no, I mean that's what he says, right? But he's obviously very tricky
Mm-hmm.
figure and reveals sort of his true nature here at the end. Yeah, it was fascinating when I had gotten my or completed the final story. I actually just sat at a campground, and there he was, and I talked to him, and yeah, and it's funny. Yeah, I died several times playing this game. Something that really
Mm-hmm.
surprised me because the character you are is kind of like a skeleton with a straw hat, and like the
Yep.
sticking, knapsack, and um, it was funny. I actually died a few times. Like I said, I didn't discover
Mm-hmm.
fast travel until very late in the game, so I was hopping a lot of trains. Well, there's always the risk that you get caught hopping a train. If you do, you get beat by the
Mm-hmm.
train conductor. Like they'll just savagely beat you. And that happened a few times to me when I had low health, and I just ended up dying.
Yep.
And when you die, you do meet up again with the dire wolf. And so I had a few opportunities to talk to him, and you can share the stories with him there, right? And so interacting with him is like interacting with people at a campfire. And so
Mm-hmm.
every now and then I would share like those stories with him, and then I would just go back out and continue the game. But yeah, when you finally meet with him, he congratulates you on completing the task and he sounds really grateful, but he also kind of says smirkingly that he's like, I'm not entirely certain that you remember all the terms of our deal. And it made me think, okay, so this is what he's really asking, what is it? Obviously, we've already done the spoiler caveat, but major spoilers, this is the final thing that happens at the end of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the direwolf smiles in his character portrait. Now he doesn't transform, but he slowly opens his jaws, and you look into his jaws, and it kind of looks like a starry night sky. And then it gets closer and closer to the screen until you're consumed. He
Mm-hmm.
he just consumes you, and then the credits roll, and I started laughing because I not because I mean just because I didn't know what to think. I was like, oh man, so he's just kind of gonna eat us. um, and I just thought it was kind of funny, and I thought it was, but very cool. I mean, like as we were going through the game and we're getting people to reveal their true selves in these, really soul like wrenching, soulful, personal, intimate stories. We get all these stories from these people. I mean, they reveal themselves to us, and I think the artistic soul portrait, is a really cool visual representation of that happening.
Mm-hmm.
And they've revealed almost, I feel like, too much to us in like a supernatural sense, where like we know so much about them, and at the very end, the dire wolf kind of does that to us. He kind of collects those little tidbits of souls that we have found in these true stories, and then he just collects us for whatever purpose. I mean, we don't really know. He doesn't really explain it. He certainly doesn't feel the need to explain it. But we've kind of been like, he saw us, as an opportunity to like kill, 16 birds with one stone, right?
Yeah.
As we gathered all of these bits of people's souls and bring them to him.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess too the wolf and that whole imagery, right, is like he devours their souls, our souls, the stories. There's I don't know.
I mean, that's how I kind of read
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's just something, and I'm still kind of working through like what I would consider to be like my main interpretation of the game. But there's something about like it's a beautiful thing to reveal your true like intimate self with somebody else, but it's also a dangerous thing. It's like an opening that somebody, well, now they know you. I mean, there's no secrets left, and a huge part of the game, is finding, you tell all these stories and then they get embellished, and as they get embellished they get less truthful, and so they are kind of they don't have that soul in them necessarily. They have a lot of entertainment. They're really fascinating, and they're interesting to listen to, and we like listening to them, but they don't resonate in quite the same way. They just don't hit the same way. And so it's like it's a beautiful thing to reveal that part of yourself, but it's also a dangerous thing because now people know who you really are, and they can judge you for that. They can sympathize with you for that too, and to a certain degree, I think, with the wolf like eating you at the end, they can also exploit that.
Yeah, that's really good. A thing that was kind of scrolling through my mind as you were talking about that is, so with you, the character, and you meet these you talk to these characters we talked about, and then they reveal their true self, that sort of stuff. There's this, I don't know, intimacy that's a part of this, right? That like, I showed you my real self. I'm, laid bare, whatever, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And for our character, we had to tell the stories to build rapport with them. We've become close, whatever, all of that stuff, that they would choose to do something like that. And that's like great in that context because we've built that relationship with them that they would want to share those things. We didn't like coax it out of them like, hey, tell us the hard stuff. Instead we built a relationship with them and it happened. But then the direwolf, to just feast on that is he's not entitled to that. He doesn't earn that intimacy. He just steals it, kind of thing. I really, really like that. This is good. Because when that happened, I think that I like just looked at it surface value and almost wondered if we were getting put in a time loop and we had to do it again.
Oh.
and that is what I took it as. I don't know why. I think what you described is much better and makes significantly more sense. But I think because of the Starry Night Sky, I was like, oh, cool, you're back on the journey. Like sort of a Sisyphus, like pushing the stone up the hill sort of thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think both ideas really do work. I mean, I think I really like how you said it too. Like at the very end, like we really see how scheming and cunning and downright cruel the dire wolf is, because he takes these things that he is not entitled to, right? Like these 16 people, and you said it very well. So I'm really just summarizing what you said. These 16 people, like, we did not force anything out of them. We did not beat them in a sketchy poker deal, forcing them to reveal their true selves, right? We did this through kinship, through swapping stories, through spending time together, and then to just have the dire wolf, I mean, come through and just take that, right? I mean, it definitely leaves you with like a bitter, maybe like empty feeling towards like, of all the rejection and like exploitation as themes that are discussed about in the game, and it's almost kind of fitting, right? Like at the very end, like, well, and you got that too. You also got screwed.
Yeah, that's true. I think that does fit. I guess that in retrospect, we should have seen it coming because of what we saw in everyone else. That the direwolf, of course, would be the same way.
Yeah, we should have seen it. We didn't. I didn't.
No, I didn't at all. I thought that I don't know, we'd be finally allowed to die or something.
Right.
That that it would be over. We fulfilled the contract, sort of thing, and
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
something like that, and it wasn't. So that's cool. So, okay, I feel like that's kind of your end cap of the game. So, finally, I wanted to leave a spot for us if there's anything else we really wanted to talk about with the game that we didn't get to talk about along the way. I only have one thing. I feel like we got to talk about a lot of good stuff, but one thing
Yeah.
that's a very interesting read is Johanneman Nordhagen wrote a post-mortem on this game on
Yeah.
medium.com, and it's really, really interesting. I wish that more games would do this. Like, I would, after experiencing this, I wish I could read a postmortem for every game I've ever played, because what he does that's really cool is he's like, okay, here's what works. And he lists, 4 or 5 things that worked well in the game. Like, we did this thing, it really landed. And then on the other side, he lists 4 or 5 things that really didn't work. And then
Yeah.
kind of draws some conclusions and stuff. But one thing that's pretty interesting in this that I don't know, it's just kind of wild, is one of the things he comments on is he says, this game had some award success. I think award shows kind of played this and were like, this is pretty cool. You should check this out. Reviewers saw some of that. But he commented that in the first month, it sold less copies than he has of Twitter followers, and he doesn't have a lot of Twitter followers. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Like, it has this kind of buzz and then just falls flat commercially, like, and wasn't, a success in those ways. And a comment he makes along the way in that article too is like, I don't know if there's a place for indie games like this where it's so experimental and not normal, because of how hard it flopped in that arena. And I don't know. I just thought it was super interesting, and I don't know, being able to see something like that and choose to say it, I thought was cool that he chose to. But I don't know. It's super interesting. I hope this game gets a cult following. I feel like it deserves it. Like, I think this is the right game for the right people, which I think are us. Like I said at the beginning, but
Right.
I hope it develops something like that where it gets some of a second life, because I think that the people this is for, I think, could really enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because what I had read after beating this game, well, first of all, like I've mentioned a few times now, I didn't discover the fast travel until the very end. And I remember I was searching about it, like, oh man, what's up with the fast travel? And then this was something that was patched in later, because of complaints about just how slow the game is. And don't get me wrong, this game is, I mean, you're moving slow. I mean, there's a whistle mechanic that helps you
Right.
speed up. You can hitchhike, you can hop trains, you can earn money, and you can get train tickets. And so there are ways to travel more quickly across the map. I actually rarely did the whistling because I enjoy the music too much, and the whistling would be louder than the music, and I just preferred to listen. I mean, don't get me wrong, when I knew that I had to walk a long distance, there's a button you can press that will just automatically walk, so you don't have to hold the stick forward. And I would just it almost felt like an idle game in that regard, where there were moments where I could just maybe work on other things, or just scroll on my phone because I knew I was going to have to walk for like 5 minutes to get somewhere. Now I
Right.
didn't. Yeah, and the thing is like I didn't really see this too much of being too much of a problem for me, but also thinking about who I am as a player. Like, this game is definitely like a game that I would enjoy. Like, I'm definitely the target demographic for this type of game. And like you said at the very beginning of this conversation, yeah, I mean, if you really like really well written things, if you like short stories, if you like, good literature, I think this is definitely the game for you. And so I think it's interesting that you mentioned in this postmortem, just is target demographic like too niche here? Like, is
Mm-hmm.
it too experimental? And I don't know. I just kind of feel like with the way that gaming has evolved, you can find an audience for almost anything. Like the most recent Wholesome Games Direct, for example, when it showcased, probably 80% of those games were like farming sims. And don't get me
Mm-hmm.
wrong, I love farming sims. And I thought to myself, wow, there are tons of farming sims in here. Almost, is it too many? And then I started paying closer attention, and I felt like each farming sim had something unique about it. And I think if we've learned anything from, Stardew Valley and its success, people love farming sims. And if people want a farming sim with a focus on romancing the characters or a hyper focus on X aspect, like, there is a game for that person. And
Mm-hmm.
so I kind of feel like with this game, now of course I don't have all the numbers, but I just feel like there is the audience for this game. I'm glad that it finally found me, but it just makes me wonder, like, how do you get these games that are a little more experimental? This one's a little more experiential. It's a little
Mm-hmm.
weirder. How do you get it into the right hands of the right players? And obviously, I don't have an answer to that question, and that's something that indie devs and publishers, they're working tirelessly to find the answer to that question. But I'm with you. I mean, I feel like this game deserves quite a lot of praise. I think it deserves all the success in the world for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I just I just wish that there was a clearer route, right, from this game and what it is to the players who are absolutely going to love this game.
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up too. Of that, like you said with the farming sims, and like really, there's an audience for anything. It seems like the
Mm-hmm.
world we're in now, I think, is more that way.
Yeah.
And that was a comment he even made in that too. Is he talked about when Gone Home came out? I think that was in 2013, and I think it was a more unique indie game at that time. And a comment
Mm-hmm.
he made is when this released in 2018, he was like, the games world had changed a bit by then. And so I
Mm.
think I had thought, oh, it worked when we did Gone Home and no one did anything like this. So if I do something else unusual, who cares? It'll work because it worked last time. But 2018 was different, which
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't transport myself to 2018 and know what was going on back then with games. But I wonder if it was different than it is right now, even, even though it's only a few
Right.
years later, like you said, because like if something like this showed up on like Game Pass, do the right people have Game Pass? Maybe some of the right ones would
Mm.
have found it, or like a thing like that. Like
Yeah.
like you described with the farming sims, it's like, okay, you care about a romance farming sim. Well, if that ends up on Game Pass and that's your kind of deal, oh man, there are going to be people that are like, hey, you like this? Go here, it's there, like that sort of thing. And so
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if something like this would be received differently today than it was even a couple years ago.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. Let's see. I'm looking at it right now. So one person that I really love and I love following on Twitter is Mike Rose, and he is in the director position at No More Robots, which is a publishing, you know,
Hmm.
uh, I'm blanking on all the terms right now. Studio. Anyway, they publish some games that I really love, and um, okay. So this is a tweet from him. This is from 15 hours as of the recording of this episode. Uh, he says, thanks to Xbox P3 for chatting with a bunch of us this morning. Some absolutely fascinating stuff about where the future video games is headed. And then he says, let's just say I'm pretty glad we have more than half a dozen games coming to Game Pass in the next 12 months. Pretty exciting space to be in right now. And it just makes me think of what you said, like in 2018, right? This is pre-pandemic. This is like before Game
Hmm.
Pass is getting all the marketing that it is. This is before PS Plus. And
Hmm.
I just like wonder, I'm like super curious, would a game like this, like if it had been in a different channel and like the in the various channels and routes that we have in 2022 wouldn't have done a ton, like, so much better. And one of the thing about like these gaming services, and I'm even thinking about like, Netflix has mobile games now too.
Yep.
That if you subscribe to Netflix, you can download them. Which, by the way, I have Before Your Eyes downloaded on my phone now.
Oh yes, it's so good.
Yeah, I can't wait to play that one. But that's extra like money opportunities. That's like extra deals that these indie studios can cut. And so it'd be super fascinating. And obviously we can't time travel and, release this game in 2022. But I want to feel hopeful and think that like, hey, this type of game, like, please, like, indie developers, like, don't give up on these types of games. Because, you and I, we played this game and we really enjoyed it, 4 years after launch. And and it's one of those games. Yeah, I wish I would have played it closer to launch and to support the studio then. But I did come around to it and I did play it, and I just kind of hope that this game does have a bit longer life in it.
Yeah, I agree. I think now my big hope is just that something sees this. It's, I don't think this was a thing then, and who knows if it would have worked. But like, if this was published by Annapurna, then it wouldn't be an issue. It probably, people would know about it. I think really my only like criticism I would have, or like main one, is that the game was probably a little bigger or longer than it needed to be, and some of that was my own fault because I got on a collectathon kind of feel.
Right.
And maybe if I didn't see how many possible stories there were, I think it's cool they showed them, but I think that it elicited a thing in me where I was like, I just got to get them all. Like, if some of that was trimmed a little bit, I wonder if that would have helped. Because I know for me, like, the first, like, 2/3 of the game I played, I was so stoked to play. Like, I was looking forward to it. I was thinking about it. I was ready. And then the last section, I was like, all right, I got to collect these stories, got to catch them all, sort of feel, which ended up divorcing some of the point of what this game was, because I got myself into a spot. It's not necessarily the game's fault, but if it was smaller, I maybe wouldn't have got there or wouldn't have got there as much. But yeah, truly cool game. I'm very, very glad to play it, and very glad we've gotten to talk about it. This has been awesome.
Yeah, this has been a super fun conversation. It's always great talking with you, Dan. I would actually echo probably the same thing you said. I mean, we've largely heaped praise on this game, and I do think it's really well-deserved. Yeah, I think in terms of criticism, I think you're right. Like, if the map had maybe been like 3/4 or 2/3 the size it was, that would have helped. Fast travel's in the game. If that was, I think, publicized, I think you'd actually get a lot more players in, because I think the experience that you and I had where, like, it's fun to walk around. It's really fun to listen to the music change as you're going to the different regions. But after a while, your goal really shifts when you get towards the end game, and you're like, you know what? I've completed 12 stories. I've got 4 stories left, and I'm anywhere between chapter 1 and 4 on them. I really just want to complete these stories now. At least, that was definitely my experience. And just to facilitate that sort of last stretch would do wonders for the game.
Yep. Yeah. I think that would go really far. Make it a little tighter, and all that. That's really all I had on the game. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap up?
That's really everything. I think I really liked it. I think it's a great game. I ended up playing it on Xbox, and I think it was a really comfortable experience playing on my couch. I don't know how you played it, but I really loved, like, I was really grateful that I had a console to play this one on. If it is on Switch, and I think it is at this point, I feel like this would be wonderful to play on Switch as well.
Yeah, I feel like it would be too. I played on PS5, but it was, super nice just to sit down, play with the controller, roam about, and get some stories.
Yeah. It was a good, relaxing time for some good stories.
Definitely. Cool. Well, yeah, that's what we've got on Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. To, I guess, wrap. again, do you want to tell people where they can find your show?
Yeah, sure thing. So just to reiterate, I am Jake from the Pre-Order Bonus Podcast. Probably the easiest way to get a hold of us is just on Twitter. I run the Twitter there, and I'm on there way too often. At PreorderCast is the best way to get a hold of us, to listen to us. We have links, there, and we have a Discord that you can hop into as well. I really like the way that our Discord is. I feel like we kind of chat in bursts, which is how I love handling that kind of stuff. And so if you like gaming and you like talking in that way, then absolutely join the Discord. But yeah, and just thank you so much, Dan. There's been so much fun. Like I said, when you shot me that message, I was like, oh man, all right, let's do this. All the stars seemed to align. I was like, we had a great time talking last time. This is a game I've had on my wish list that I wanted to play, and I'm really glad that we got to make this happen.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really glad too. Also, if you want more of us talking, we mentioned the Super Mario Odyssey episode, but also I went on your guys' show. We talked about Donut County.
Yes.
So there is more of that. So if you want more of us talking games, also 3 pretty different games. So that's fun.
Yes.
That it worked out that way. But yeah, there's more of this. So definitely check that out. But yeah, thanks again for coming on. I'm really glad we got to do this. If folks want to catch up with us, my Twitter's at StoryEverPod. Our website's TheGreatestStoryEverPlayed.com. That's got all of our episodes on it. Also links to Apple Podcast or wherever you get podcast for all of our episodes, including the Super Mario Odyssey one, among a bunch of other story games, if that interests you. Our Patreon's patreon.com/TheGreatestStoryEverPlayed. There, if you want to financially support the podcast, you could do that for as little as $1 per month. And that will give you access to monthly bonus episodes we do. So talking about things like our favorite games from childhood or things outside of video games. I think one I want to do in the future is rank the Star Wars movies because I've been rewatching them.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, that'll be fun. So stuff like that, if that interests you, that'd be cool. If you want to support the podcast but can't financially, that's totally fine. I think things that could help out a lot is just telling a friend or rating it on Apple Podcast or wherever you get podcasts. Just helping to get the word out. I know one thing I've really enjoyed with this podcast is having community to enjoy games with and sharing those thoughts, feelings, etc. about them. So yeah, that would be cool. And yeah, that's our episode, and we will see you next time.